The spring box sits half buried in cat claw. Concrete cracked, iron pipe rusted through, water smell without visible water. Flies circle something that should be dry. The investigator kneels, runs his hand along the old stonework where someone mortared a basin into rock. Someone who understood this mountain range survives on these pockets of green, surrounded by miles of nothing. Bootprints lead to the edge, then vanish where everything turns to stone. Wind moves through the brush with a sound like whispering, like the mountain keeping secrets it learned a century ago when cattle empires were built not with gunfire, but with something quieter. A fence staple hangs half-pulled from a wooden post, the wire long gone, the post still standing like a grave marker no one comes to read anymore. This was never a cattle story, this was a water story. Was Norton's power built by gunfire, or by a locked gate? Water decides everything here. The investigator kneels beside a concrete trough, half buried in creosote and cat claw, running his hand along the cracked rim where cattle once drank. The basin is dry now, but the stone around it holds a different color, darker, stained by decades of moisture seeping through rock that should never stay wet. This is how you read the desert, not by what you see, but by what used to be there, by the ghost-shaped water leaves behind. When it moves on or gets locked away by someone who understood that controlling a spring means controlling everything downstream, the grass, the roots, the ranches that live or die based on whether you let them drink. The Galiuro wilderness has no perennial streams. The government surveys confirm this. 76,317 acres of mountain country where water does not flow year-round, where survival depends on springs that bubble up from fractured rock and vanish again into sand within 100 yards. Powers Garden Spring, Mud Spring, Corral Spring, Juniper Spring, Walnut Spring, Cedar Spring, Holdout Spring. The names sound like poetry until you understand they are a map, a list of the only places in this entire range where life can gather without dying of thirst, where a rancher with the right paperwork or the right fence line can decide who gets access and who does not. Out here, a fence is a verdict. The investigator stands, wipes dust from his hands, and follows a wash uphill toward a seep marked on his topographic map. The canyon walls close in. Sycamore roots claw at bedrock. Somewhere above, a spring makes a pocket of green in a landscape that burns brown most of the year. He is looking for proof of something locals remember but records barely mention, that a company called Norton Land and Cattle once controlled enough of these water sources to turn the Galiuros into a private empire without ever needing to own all the land, just the springs, just the gates, just the narrow places where a thirsty cow has no choice but to cross ground that belongs to someone else. The deed matters less than the water. That is the rule in Arizona. You can own 1,000,000 acres and still die if someone upstream decides to close a valve or string wire across a creek crossing. The investigator has traced this pattern across a dozen western ranges, cattle companies that never made headlines, never fought range wars, never needed to, because they understood the desert runs on access. And access can be controlled quietly, legally, with a surveyor's chain and a brand book entry and a handshake with the right banker. Norton shows up in the 1921 Arizona brand book with multiple-page references. The company name appears in court records, but the stories that survive are vague, inflated, impossible to verify. 50 miles both ways on each side of the San Pedro River. 28 brands, 2,500 calves branded in 1 year. The numbers feel too big, too clean, like someone rounded up for effect and no one bothered to check. He climbs higher. The spring appears exactly where the map promises, a wet seam in the rock, a trickle that barely fills his cupped hand. Around it, deer tracks press into mud. Javelina scat. Coyote prints leading to the only shade for miles. This is what empire looks like in the desert. Not a river, not a lake, just a crack in the stone that stays wet when everything else burns dry. And whoever controls it controls the country around it for as far as a cow can walk in 2 days without water. The investigator photographs the spring box, the old pipework, the remains of a diversion someone built and someone else tore out. He pulls up his map overlay on his phone, springs plotted as blue dots, old ranch boundaries sketched in red, grazing permit zones shaded green. The pattern starts to clarify. Norton did not need to own the Galuros. They just needed to own the springs. And once you own the springs, you own the roots between them. And once you own the roots, you can charge for passage or deny it outright, and the land itself becomes a kind of toll road where grass is free, but water costs everything. The sun drops behind the ridge. Shadows fill the canyon. The investigator caps his water bottle, checks his GPS, starts the long hike back to the trailhead. He has found what he came for, not drama, not violence, just a spring that still flows and a concrete trough that proves someone once cared enough to build infrastructure here, to make this remote seep into a working piece of a larger system. The empire is gone now. The fences are down, the gates hang open, but the water still comes up through the rock, still makes green in the brown, still decides who survives and who does not. That part never changes. Chapter 2. A mountain range built to hide. You can disappear in these canyons. The investigator drives a dirt road that turns from graded washboard to loose rock, to barely a suggestion scraped into hillside. His truck climbs through ocotillo and prickly pear, through elevation zones that shift every 1,000 feet, desert floor to grassland to oak woodland to pine forest that clings to north-facing slopes where winter never fully lets go. The Galuro Mountains rise like a fortress in southeastern Arizona, a range so remote that most people who live an hour away have never set foot inside it, a landscape designed by geology and isolation to keep secrets because there are no easy routes in, no paved roads, no cell service, no witnesses to what happens in the deep canyons where stone walls climb 1,000 feet straight up, and the only sound is wind moving through limestone that remembers when this was all ocean floor. He parks where the road ends. The wilderness boundary starts here. No motors beyond this point, no bikes, no machinery, just boots and time, and the willingness to walk into country that does not care whether you make it back out. He shoulders his pack, checks his map, starts hiking up a trail that fades in and out of existence, depending on how many seasons have passed since the last hiker bothered to follow it. The mountains feel older than anything human, harder, built from volcanic rock and limestone and granite that refuses to erode at anything resembling human speed, ridgelines that stretch for miles without a single gap wide enough to drive through, canyons that dead-end against cliffs that turn cattle back or force them into narrow chutes where a man with a gait can decide whether they pass or starve. This is why isolation matters. Fewer witnesses means fewer records, means fewer people willing to challenge boundaries that shift in the dark. Out here, a fence line drawn on a surveyor's map might sit 5 miles from where the actual posts stand, and by the time anyone notices, the cows have been drinking from your spring for a decade, and possession starts to look like proof. The investigator climbs higher. His boots scrape on limestone. Manzanita claws at his sleeves. Below him, the desert spreads out in shades of tan and rust, and the far-off green line of the San Pedro River, a ribbon of cottonwoods that marks the only permanent water for 30 miles in any direction, the artery that made ranching possible here, and the prize that every cattle company from the 1870s onward tried to control, not by owning the riverbed, but by owning the routes to it, the springs that feed into it, the crossings where livestock have to ford or die trying. The Galluro Wilderness covers 76,317 acres of mountain country that runs from 4,000 feet elevation at the desert edge to 7,671 feet at Bassett Peak. That is 3,671 feet of vertical relief packed into a range that measures roughly 12 miles north to south, a landscape so steep and broken that even modern topographic maps struggle to show the true shape of the canyons, the hidden benches, the places where water collects and vanishes again into rock. The numbers make it sound manageable. 76,000 acres translates to about 119 square miles, a piece of country you could theoretically walk across in 2 long days if the terrain were flat and cooperative. But terrain here is never cooperative. Every mile horizontal costs you 1,000 feet vertical. Every canyon crossing means descending to bedrock and climbing back out the far side. Distance measured in hours, not miles, in how much water you carry and how much daylight remains, and whether you trust your knees on the descent. For a rancher in the 1880s or the 1920s, this terrain was not an obstacle, it was an advantage. Cattle that learn to live in these mountains do not drift. They stay near the springs they know. They follow the same routes their mothers followed, the same trails worn into stone by decades of hooves moving between water and grass and shelter. And if you control those springs, if you build tanks at the right places and string fence across the few easy passages, you can run cattle across public land without ever filing a claim, because the land itself becomes a fence. And the mountains do the work of keeping herds separated, keeping trespassers out, keeping the whole system locked down tight enough that the only paper trail is a brand book entry and maybe a deed to a homestead that sits at the mouth of the one canyon that matters. The investigator reaches a saddle, sits on a flat rock, drinks warm water from a bottle that tastes like plastic and iodine. Around him, the wilderness stretches empty. No roads, no power lines, no buildings visible in any direction, just stone and sky and the dark line of a canyon cutting deeper into the range where something, ruins maybe, or another spring, waits to be found. The emptiness is not empty. It is full of traces, boot-width trails, cairns marking routes that do not appear on any map, fence staples driven into juniper posts that rotted away 30 years ago, leaving only rust and a hole in the wood to prove someone once cared about this exact spot, this exact boundary, this exact line between mine and yours. He stands, adjusts his pack, continues into the range. The mountains close around him. Silence, then wind. Then the distant buzz of a raven calling from a thermal 1,000 feet overhead. He came here looking for proof of a quiet empire, and the mountains are giving him exactly what they gave Norton: isolation, control, and the kind of landscape where power does not need to announce itself because geography does the announcing, and anyone who tries to challenge it has to walk 20 miles just to see what they are challenging. Out here, distance is defense, the emptiness is the fortress, and water is the key to every locked gate. Chapter 3. The springs have names. The map is a thirst map. The investigator sits on a limestone outcrop with his phone and a paper topographic sheet spread across his knees, marking every spring in the Galluro Range with a blue dot, Powers Garden, Mud Spring, Corral Spring, Juniper Spring, Walnut Spring, Cedar Spring, Holdout Spring. Each name tells a story about who found it first, or what happened there, or how long you can hold out if this is the only water for 10 miles. And when you connect the dots with lines that represent the routes cattle would naturally walk between water sources, the wilderness stops looking like empty public land and starts looking like a chessboard, where springs are the pieces that matter, and everything else is just space between moves. He counts 14 named springs in the range, maybe 20 if you include seeps that only flow after monsoon. That is 14 choke points in 76,000 acres, 14 places where a rancher with the right permits or the right fence can watch every cow in the mountains file past and decide which ones belong and which ones are trespassing on water that legally belongs to no one, but functionally belongs to whoever controls the infrastructure around it. This is how you build an empire without headlines. You do not fight range wars. You do not shoot rivals. You just make sure that every route to water crosses your land or your lease or your handshake agreement with the Forest Service, and then you wait for thirst to do the work that violence used to do, because a cow will walk 5 miles for grass but not 10 miles for water. And if your spring is at mile 3 and the next spring is at mile 15, you own everything in between without ever filing a deed. The investigator stands, folds his map, starts hiking toward a spring marked on the sheet as Powers Garden, a name that suggests either someone named Power or someone who understood that water in the desert is the only power that matters, the kind you do not negotiate with, the kind that makes grass grow or makes it die, and does not care which outcome you prefer. The trail descends into a side canyon where sycamores grow thick enough to block the sun. He hears the spring before he sees it, a trickle, a wet sound in a dry world, water moving over stone and disappearing into gravel 20 feet downstream. The spring box is still there, concrete poured into a natural depression, an iron pipe jutting from the hillside, a valve rusted half open. Someone built this decades ago, maybe longer. Someone paid for cement and pipe and labor in a place so remote that every ounce of material had to be packed in on mule or carried on a man's back. And the only reason to make that investment is if you plan to stay. If you plan to run enough cattle through this canyon that the spring needs to be reliable, needs to be controlled, needs to feed a trough that holds water even when the natural seep slows to a drip in late summer. He photographs the infrastructure. The pour date is gone, worn off by weather, but the style of the work suggests early 1900s, thick concrete, hand-troweled, built to last. Around the spring, the ground is trampled bare, deer tracks, cattle tracks from some earlier era, a few boot prints that might be from other hikers or might be from the last rancher who checked this spring before the wilderness designation shut down grazing and turned these water sources from working assets into historical curiosities that nobody maintains and nobody needs except the wildlife that inherited them when the cows left. The investigator kneels, cups his hand, tastes the water. Cold, mineral, clean enough. This is what cattle empires were built on. Not romance, not adventure, just a reliable trickle in a landscape where reliability is worth more than land, more than grass, more than anything except the access routes that connect one spring to the next. He pulls out his map overlay again, this time adding a new layer. Property boundaries from the 1980s, when homesteaders and ranchers were filing claims on 160-acre parcels that included a spring or a creek crossing or a canyon mouth that controlled passage to higher country. The pattern is obvious once you see it. The claims do not sprawl evenly across the desert. They cluster around water, a homestead at Power's Garden, another at Mud Spring, a patented mining claim near Juniper Spring that probably never produced ore but gave the owner legal standing to fence the drainage and charge rivals for access to the route beyond. This is the invisible architecture of the range, not the land itself, but the control points, the places where a locked gate means you turn back or you break the law. And most people turn back because the law is cheaper than fighting, and fighting is cheaper than dying of thirst 10 miles from water with a herd that cannot make it home. The investigator stands, wipes his hands on his jeans, checks the time. 3 hours of daylight left. He marks the spring's location on his GPS, makes notes about the infrastructure, starts the climb back toward the main trail. Behind him, the water keeps flowing. It flowed before Norton. It flows now. It will flow long after the last person who remembers the company name is gone, because water does not care about ownership, does not care about empires, does not care about anything except gravity and limestone fractures and the slow, patient work of moving through stone. But the people who controlled it, they cared. They cared enough to pour concrete in a place where no one would ever see it unless they walked 5 miles into wilderness. They cared enough to name it. And the name stuck long after the empire vanished, because springs outlive the men who fence them, and maps remember what memories forget. Chapter 4. The Mining Town That Built the Ranch. Follow the money backward. The investigator drives down from the mountains toward a place that barely exists anymore, Copper Creek, a mining camp that once held 2,000 people and now holds maybe 20, a scatter of trailers and one old stone building that refuses to fall down even though everything around it already has. The road crosses a wash where mesquite grows thick as a wall, then climbs a low ridge, and suddenly there it is. The Sibley Mansion, 3 stories of cut stone rising from the desert like a monument to ambition or delusion or both, walls 2 feet thick, windows that once held glass, now holding only sky. A house built in 1906 by a man who believed copper prices would stay high forever, and that a mining superintendent deserved to live like royalty even if his workers lived in tents. The mansion cost more to build than most people in southern Arizona earned in a lifetime, and it stands empty now, beautiful and useless, a reminder that every cattle empire in this country started as something else: timber money, railroad money, mining money. Because you cannot build a ranch from scratch on cowboy wages, you need capital, and capital comes from holes in the ground or holes in other people's pockets. Copper Creek Mining District produced over $4 million in metals between 1905 and 1959. That is verified. The ore came out rich, copper, silver, gold in smaller quantities, and the money flowed into Tucson banks and Eastern investment funds and the pockets of men who understood that mineral wealth is temporary, but land is forever, or at least it feels that way until the grass runs out. The mining companies needed beef to feed workers. The ranchers needed buyers who paid cash. The system worked until it did not, until copper prices fell, or veins pinched out, or labor trouble shut down operations, and then the ranchers who built their operations around steady mining contracts suddenly found themselves with cattle and no market, with land and no income, with expenses that do not stop just because the boom ended. This is where Norton enters the story, not as cowboys or gunslingers, but as opportunists with enough cash or credit to buy distressed range when mining towns went bust and desperate ranchers sold cheap. The investigator walks through the mansion's empty rooms, boots crunching on broken plaster and bat guano, looking up at ceiling joists that were meant to support chandeliers and formal dinners, and the weight of a social structure that said some men deserve stone houses and most men deserve nothing. He climbs the stairs carefully. Some treads are rotted through, and stands at a window on the third floor, looking out across miles of desert and mountains that once fed cattle to this town, that once made economic sense in a calculation that depended on miners eating beef 3 times a day, and never asking where it came from or who got trampled raising it. The mansion is not just architecture, it is a balance sheet in stone. Someone spent serious money building this. Imported materials, skilled masons, a foundation designed to last centuries, and the only reason to make that investment in a place this remote is if you believe the returns will justify the cost, if you believe the ore will keep coming, and the workers will keep buying, and the whole fragile system will hold together long enough for you to extract your profit and get out. But the system did not hold. The mines closed, the workers left, the mansion became a shell, and the ranchers who survived were the ones who understood that cattle empires are not about cattle, they are about controlling the inputs, the water and the grass and the roots, so that when one market collapses, you can pivot to another, can sell to different buyers, can outlast the boom-bust cycle by being flexible enough to bend and hard enough not to break. The investigator descends the stairs, steps back outside into hard sunlight that makes the stone walls glow white. Around the mansion, the ghost town spreads in fragments. A collapsed mine head frame, rusted cable, the stone foundations of buildings that once held a post office and general store and saloon. This is the landscape Norton inherited or exploited, or both. A region where mining had concentrated capital and infrastructure and then abandoned it, leaving behind rail spurs and roads and water systems that a smart rancher could repurpose, could turn from industrial assets into agricultural ones, could use to run cattle through country that had been opened up by someone else's investment and someone else's failure. The empire was not built on grass that belonged to no one. It was built on infrastructure that belonged to ghosts. He walks back to his truck, sits in the cab with the door open, makes notes on his phone. Copper Creek to the Galliuros is 12 miles as the crow flies, maybe 20 by trail. Close enough that a rancher with permits in the mountains could winter cattle on the desert floor near the old mining camps, could use the town's leftover corrals and loading chutes, could sell to whatever market remained after the miners left, military contracts, Indian reservations, distant stockyards in Kansas City or Denver. The mining boom made the ranch possible. The mining bust made it profitable. And somewhere in between, Norton Land and Cattle Company appeared in the brand book with enough presence to claim multiple pages, enough reach to make people remember the name, decades after the company itself dissolved into silence and paperwork and the kind of disappearance that comes not from violence, but from entropy, from foreclosure, from the quiet way empires end when the numbers stop working and no one fights to save them, because fighting costs more than walking away. Chapter 5. The Brand Book Entry. The proof fits in your hand. The investigator sits in a climate-controlled archive room in Phoenix, white cotton gloves on, turning pages in the 1921 Arizona Brand Book, a ledger where every registered cattle operation in the state had to record their mark, their location, their claim to ownership over animals that all look the same until you burn a pattern into their hide. Most entries are brief, a name, a brand design, maybe a county. Norton Land and Cattle Company gets multiple page references, not one entry, multiple. That means multiple brands, multiple locations, enough operational complexity that the state bureaucracy could not fit them into a single line, and in a business where most outfits run one brand on one piece of country, multiple entries suggest scale, reach, the kind of operation that does not just run cattle, but runs them across enough territory that different herds need different marks to keep the bookkeeping straight and the theft accusations manageable. He photographs each page. The brand designs are simple, letters and symbols that a hot iron can reproduce, that a rider can recognize from 100 yards, that a buyer at a stockyard can verify without needing a lawyer. The locations are vague: Pima County, Graham County, references to the San Pedro Valley. No specific addresses because ranches this size do not have street numbers. They have landmarks, drainages, the names of springs and peaks that only locals recognize, and if you do not know the country well enough to find those places on your own, you probably have no business trying to do business there. The brand book does not tell you how many cattle Norton ran or how much land they controlled or who owned the company. It just confirms they existed. They were legal. They were substantial enough to merit official documentation in an era when plenty of outfits ran stock without bothering to register anything because registration costs money and creates a paper trail. And some people prefer to operate in the gaps where records do not reach. This is the foundation of the investigation, not folklore, not stories that grow with each telling, but a government document that proves Norton was real, was recognized, was part of the formal cattle economy in southern Arizona during the 1920s. From here, the investigator can work forward and backward through other records, looking for deeds and water rights and grazing permits and court cases, building a skeleton of facts that the stories can hang on, because every ghost needs bones, and every legend needs at least one piece of evidence that cannot be explained away as memory or exaggeration or the way people remember things that never quite happened the way they remember them happening. The brand book is that evidence, cold, official, undeniable. He moves to the next section of the archive, court records, indexed by plaintiff and defendant, searchable by company name if you have patience and time and a willingness to read through hundreds of cases that have nothing to do with what you are looking for until suddenly one does. He finds it 3 hours into the search. Norton versus Tucson Cattle Loan Company, Arizona Supreme Court, June 19, 1925. The case involves a Pima County ranch, a takeover in November 1921, and a dispute over secured debt and foreclosure that went all the way to the state's highest court, which means serious money, serious lawyers, serious consequences for whoever lost. He reads the opinion carefully, making notes in a spiral notebook because the archive does not allow laptops in the rare documents room. The numbers are exact: $16,000 injected for running expenses, $73,500 in secured debt under chattel mortgage, $6,475 advanced on endorsed notes, a foreclosure bid of $60,000, a deficiency judgment of $68,899.87, disputed proceeds of $5,614.88. These are not estimates. These are figures pulled from loan documents and court testimony and the kind of financial records that survive when everything else burns or rots or gets thrown away by someone cleaning out a garage 50 years later. The amounts are staggering for 1921, enough money to buy entire towns, enough debt to crush a family, enough complexity to suggest that Norton was not a simple ranching operation, but a financial entity with access to credit, with relationships to banks, with the ability to leverage assets and move money and survive legal challenges that would have destroyed a smaller outfit. The court opinion does not say who won. It clarifies a procedural question about chattel mortgages and deficiency judgments, then sends the case back to a lower court for further proceedings that may or may not have ever happened, because sometimes legal fights just fade when both sides run out of money or energy or the willingness to keep bleeding cash into a system that enriches lawyers more than litigants. But the case proves Norton operated at scale. They had cattle worth securing. They had debt worth fighting over. They had enough presence in the financial system that a bank considered them worth suing, and a court considered the dispute worth deciding. This is not folklore. This is capitalism in its rawest form, collateral and credit, and the mathematical certainty that when the numbers stop working, someone loses everything and someone else picks through the wreckage looking for assets to salvage. The investigator closes the file, returns it to the archivist, walks out into Phoenix heat that hits like a physical force after hours in air conditioning. He sits in his truck with the AC running, reviewing his notes. Brand book, court case, verified numbers. The outline of an empire is starting to emerge, not from stories about 50 miles of river or 28 brands or thousands of calves, but from the quiet documentation of a business that borrowed money, moved cattle, fought foreclosure, and left just enough paper behind to prove it was not imaginary, even if almost everything else about it has vanished into the same desert that swallowed the mines and the mansions and the railroad spurs that once made this country feel like it had a future. Chapter 6. The Stories People Remember. Now the stories get complicated. The investigator sits across from an elderly rancher in a cafe in Mammoth, Arizona, a town that used to mine copper and now mines nostalgia from tourists driving between Phoenix and Tucson. The rancher is in his 80s, third generation in this country, and he remembers hearing about Norton from his grandfather, who supposedly knew someone who rode for them back when the outfit was still running strong. The stories sound big, 50 miles both ways on each side of the San Pedro River, 28 different brands, 2,500 calves branded in a single year, 1,500 steers sold to a Denver buyer in one shipment, numbers that feel too round, too clean, too much like the kind of legend that grows every time it gets told, but the rancher delivers them with absolute certainty, the way people repeat things they heard so many times as children that the repetition becomes its own kind of proof. The investigator takes notes. He does not argue. He learned long ago that correcting people's memories only makes them defensive, and defense closes doors, and closed doors end investigations. Instead, he asks questions. Where exactly did Norton run cattle? The rancher waves his hand in a circle that encompasses half of southern Arizona. What years were they operating? The rancher shrugs. Somewhere between the teens and the 30s, maybe longer, hard to say because the old-timers never talked about dates, just seasons and droughts and the year so-and-so died or got married or lost everything in a bad market. Who owned the company? Another shrug. Easton money, maybe? Tucson bankers? Someone with enough capital to make a go of it until they did not make a go of it anymore. And then the bank took over and sold off the pieces, and the name disappeared. But the stories stuck because people remember empires even when they cannot remember who built them or why they fell. This is the tension at the heart of the investigation. The verified facts are thin, a brand book entry, a court case, some numbers that prove Norton existed and operated at scale, and eventually got tangled up in debt and foreclosure. But the stories are thick, vivid, repeated across generations, and they all point toward the same basic shape, a large cattle operation that controlled access and water across a huge territory, that ran multiple brands, that moved stock in quantities large enough to matter in regional markets, and that vanished so completely that most people under 50 have never heard the name, even though older ranchers still use it as a landmark when giving directions or describing boundaries. Norton Spring, Norton Canyon, Norton Crossing. The places remember what the people have started to forget. The investigator pays for coffee, thanks the rancher, drives back toward the Galuros, thinking about evidence and memory and the difference between what happened and what people believe happened, and whether that difference matters if the effects are the same. The stories might exaggerate the scale. 50 miles of river control sounds like mythology. 28 brands sounds like empire-building fantasy. But the core pattern matches the verified records. Multiple brands documented. Not 28 necessarily, but more than one, more than most small outfits ran. A company with multiple brands. A company with enough debt to fight over in court. A company that operated across Pima and Graham counties, which puts them in position to control routes between the mountains and the river, between summer range and winter range, between the places where cattle live and the places where cattle get sold. The exaggeration does not erase the truth. It just decorates it, adds drama, turns a business into a legend, because legends are easier to remember than balance sheets, and easier to pass down than the boring mechanical details of how you actually run a ranch across broken country with no roads and unreliable water. He stops at a pullout where the highway crests a ridge and the Galuros rise dark against the eastern sky. Somewhere in those mountains, Norton ran cattle, or controlled the routes where other people's cattle had to pass. Somewhere in the county, records, deeds, and water rights and grazing permits might still exist if you know where to look and have the patience to search. Somewhere in family papers and bank archives and forgotten filing cabinets, more evidence might be waiting. Letters, ledgers, photographs, the mundane paperwork of an operation that was real before it became myth. But the myth serves a purpose too. It keeps the name alive. It marks the landscape. It reminds people that this empty-looking country was once carved into territories and claimed by outfits powerful enough that their control felt permanent, even though nothing about ranching is permanent. Nothing about water rights is guaranteed, and nothing about the desert cooperates with human plans for longer than the weather allows. The investigator makes a note in his phone, verify the 28 brands claim, check if other Norton cases exist in court records, search for grazing permits in Forest Service archives. The stories are not proof, but they are breadcrumbs, hints about where to look next, clues about what mattered enough to people that they kept repeating it across generations. 50 miles of river might be exaggeration, but some amount of river control was real. 28 brands might be inflation, but multiple brands were documented. The numbers might be wrong, but the shape they describe, a water-based empire that operated quietly and collapsed quietly and left almost nothing behind except place names and memories and the faint outline of a system that worked until it did not. That shape matches everything else the investigator has found. The stories are not lies, they are just stories, and like all stories, they tell the truth sideways, in the details that stick, in the parts people cannot stop repeating, even when they have forgotten why those parts matter. Chapter 7. The River That Made It Possible. The San Pedro decides everything. The investigator stands on a bluff above the river valley, looking down at a ribbon of cottonwoods that marks the only permanent water in a landscape that bakes to bone dry most of the year. The river runs north from Mexico through southern Arizona, cutting a green corridor through desert that would be uninhabitable without it, a lifeline for birds migrating between continents, for wildlife that depends on year-round water, for the cattle operations that lined its banks in the 1800s and early 1900s, when ranchers understood that controlling access to this river meant controlling everything upstream and downstream, every tributary, every crossing, every route that livestock had to follow when moving between mountain summer range and valley winter pasture. The San Pedro is not impressive by most standards, shallow enough to wade most of the year, narrow enough to throw a stone across, prone to flash floods that can turn it into a brown torrent that tears out fences and drowns cattle and then recedes just as quickly, leaving behind new channels and mud and the wreckage of whatever infrastructure stood in the way. But in desert country, any permanent water is power. The investigator hikes down to the riverbank, stepping through thick stands of mesquite and acacia that grow nowhere else in this region, plants that need their roots in moisture, that mark the floodplain like a botanical map of where water reaches even in the driest years. He finds cattle trails worn into the bank, old trails, unused now, but deep enough that decades of hooves carved them into stone, proof that this crossing mattered, that animals came here predictably enough, that the earth recorded their passage. Across the river, a fence line runs parallel to the water. The posts are weathered gray, the wire sagging, but the boundary is still visible, still claiming that this side is different from that side, that ownership or access or some legal fiction divides what the river unites. This is where Norton's empire intersected with everyone else's. The stories say they controlled 50 miles both ways on each side of the San Pedro, an exaggeration, probably, but pointing toward a truth that is harder to measure, which is that controlling the river crossings and the springs that feed into it gives you leverage over a territory far larger than what you actually own, because cattle do not respect property lines, but they do respect thirst. And if your land sits between their water and their grass, they have to cross you or die, and crossing means paying a fee or signing a contract or accepting terms that favor the person who owns the bottleneck. The investigator pulls out his map overlay again, this time adding river access points, fords, bridges, the places where banks are low enough that livestock can enter and exit without getting trapped in quicksand or steep mud. The access points are limited. Most of the river runs between banks too steep or too thick, with brush for easy crossing. The spots where terrain allows passage become natural choke points, and whoever controls those spots, controls movement across the entire valley, can charge for passage or deny it outright, can force rival ranchers into long detours or expensive negotiations, or the kind of legal battles that show up decades later in court records when someone finally pushes back hard enough that judges have to decide who owns what, and whether ownership means anything when geography and water rights and prior use create a different map than the one drawn in county offices. Norton appears in those battles, not always winning, not always clearly identified, but present, named, recognized as a party with standing, with assets worth fighting over, with enough control that disputing their claims required lawyers and testimony and the machinery of law, rather than just cutting their fences and moving on. The river made the ranch possible. The investigator sits on a flat rock at the water's edge, watching the current slide past, clear enough to see stones on the bottom, cool enough to make the air around it breathable even in midday heat. He thinks about the cattle economy of the 1920s, the boom that followed World War I when beef prices climbed and ranchers expanded and banks lent money against future profits that seemed guaranteed, and then the bust that came after when prices collapsed and debt came due, and the same operations that looked like empires suddenly looked like bankruptcy waiting to happen. Norton borrowed heavily. The court records prove it. $16,000 for running expenses, $73,500 in secured debt. Those numbers only make sense if the lenders believed the operation could generate enough revenue to service the loans, could sell enough cattle at high enough prices to cover costs and interest and still return profit. But the revenue depended on the river, on water for stock, on crossings that connected grazing land to shipping points, on access routes that could move cattle from mountain range to railroad without losing weight or time or animals to theft and predation and the thousand small disasters that turn projected profit into actual loss. When the river ran strong, the system worked. When drought hit, and drought always hits in southern Arizona, not as an exception, but as the baseline condition interrupted occasionally by wet years, the system strained, the grass failed, the cattle weakened, the numbers stopped adding up, and the lenders started asking questions that had no good answers because you cannot negotiate with climate, cannot promise rain, cannot guarantee that next year will be better when history suggests next year will probably be worse. The desert collects its debt. The river gives, and the river takes away. And the ranchers who survive are the ones who understand that water is not an asset you own. It is a partner who makes all the decisions and just lets you think you are in control until the day you learn otherwise. The numbers looked perfect on paper. The investigator sits in a university library scrolling through digitized livestock market reports from the early 1920s, newspapers from Kansas City, Denver, Chicago, the stockyard cities where Arizona cattle ended their journey and turned into cash. Beef prices climbed steadily after World War I. Demand stayed high. Ranchers who had struggled through the teens suddenly found themselves with assets worth borrowing against, with herds that justified expansion, with a future that seemed guaranteed as long as the consumption patterns held, and the eastern markets kept buying, and the whole fragile system stayed balanced on the assumption that prosperity was permanent. Arizona cattle numbers exploded. In 1871, the territory held maybe 40,000 head. By the early 1890s, that number hit 1.5 million, a 37-fold increase in 2 decades, growth so steep it could not possibly sustain itself. But nobody wanted to hear that when money was flowing and land was open and grass seemed infinite if you just spread the herds wide enough across public range. Norton entered during the boom, or capitalized on it. The exact timeline is unclear, but the pattern fits. The Brand book entry from 1921 puts them in the system during peak expansion. The court case from 1925 shows debt accumulating fast. This is the classic arc of Western ranching: borrow during good times, assume good times will continue, invest in infrastructure and breeding stock and land leases, watch the operation grow until it becomes too big to fail, except it is never too big to fail, because cattle empires are not built on stone foundations, they are built on grass and water and commodity prices, and when any one of those variables shifts, the whole structure tilts, and the debt that looked manageable when beef sold for premium suddenly looks catastrophic when the market turns and buyers start offering half what they paid last year. The investigator finds a price chart. Beef in 1919, strong. Beef in 1920, stronger. Beef in 1921, holding. Beef in 1922, starting to soften. By 1923, the decline is unmistakable. Prices drop 10%, then 20%, then more. The ranchers who expanded on borrowed money suddenly face a choice: sell at a loss and pay down debt, or hold the cattle and hope prices recover. Gambling that next year will be better, even though the fundamentals suggest next year will be worse, because the boom created overproduction. Too many cattle chasing too few buyers. A glut that will take years to work through, and during those years, someone has to eat the losses, and usually it is not the banks or the buyers, it is the ranchers caught in the middle with notes coming due and no good options. Norton's debt numbers suggest they chose to hold and hope. $16,000 for running expenses, that is operating capital, money to keep the ranch functioning while waiting for markets to improve. $73,500 in secured debt under chattel mortgage, that is the cattle themselves pledged as collateral. The herd turned into a financial instrument that only has value if you can sell it for more than you owe. And if prices keep falling, the collateral shrinks faster than the debt. $6,475 advanced on endorsed notes, that is personal guarantees, someone's signature promising to pay, regardless of whether the cattle operation survives, the kind of commitment that keeps ranchers awake at night, wondering if they just bet their family's future on weather and markets and forces completely outside their control. The boom-bust cycle is not unique to Norton. It is the underlying rhythm of every cattle operation that tries to scale beyond what the land can naturally support. The investigator finds parallel stories in the same newspapers, other Arizona ranches foreclosed, other operations sold at auction, other families who believed the expansion would pay off, and learned too late that growth in cattle country is not like growth in other industries. You cannot simply produce more and expect the market to absorb it, because beef is commodified, and buyers have power, and when supply exceeds demand, the producers are the ones who suffer, while the middlemen and packers and railroad companies still take their cut, regardless of who wins or loses at the ranch level. The system is designed to extract value from the people doing the actual work, the ranchers and the cowboys and the vaqueros who ride the fences and check the water and pull calves and break ice and do the physical labor that makes the industry possible while getting paid wages that barely cover survival and watching owners accumulate debt that will eventually crush them. One bad season can turn an empire into an auction notice. That is not metaphor. That is documented pattern. Drought in Arizona often hits in cycles. A wet year or two followed by 5 or 7 dry years that test every ranch's reserves, every water system's capacity, every calculation about carrying capacity and sustainable stocking rates. If the dry years coincide with low prices, the combination is lethal. Cattle lose weight, ranges deteriorate, feed costs climb, revenue falls, debt compounds, and somewhere in a bank office far from the desert, a loan officer starts looking at the numbers and realizes the borrower cannot possibly repay, and begins the legal machinery of foreclosure, not out of cruelty, just out of mathematics. The cold accounting that says this asset is worth less than the loan secured against it, and the bank needs to recover what it can before the value drops further. Norton faced that math. The court case proves it. Whether they survived it or succumbed to it is the next question, and the records from here forward start to thin, start to scatter, start to disappear into the gaps where documentation ends and memory takes over. And the line between what happened and what people think happened becomes impossible to draw with certainty. Chapter 9. Drought makes enemies fast. Dry years turn people hard. The investigator stands over cracked mud where a stock tank should hold water, a depression scraped into earth that catches runoff during monsoon season and holds it through the dry months if the rains were heavy enough and evaporation does not steal it first. This tank is empty, bone dry. The mud at the bottom has split into polygons, geometric patterns that form when clay shrinks and pulls apart, exposing layers underneath that have not seen sun in years or maybe decades, depending on when this tank last held enough water to matter. Around the rim, dead grass stands in brittle clumps. Mesquite grows thick where it should not grow, taking advantage of moisture that concentrated here when the tank was functional, now slowly dying back as the water source fails and the desert reclaims territory it lent briefly to something greener. Drought is not a twist here. It is the baseline threat. Arizona ranching exists in a state of permanent water stress, interrupted occasionally by wet years that make people forget how marginal the whole enterprise actually is, how close every operation runs to the edge of viability, how quickly conditions can shift from manageable to catastrophic when rainfall fails and springs slow to a trickle, and the San Pedro drops low enough that you can walk across it without getting your boots wet. The historical record documents the pattern. Dry cycles lasting 5 years, 7 years, sometimes a decade. Cattle die in numbers large enough that ranchers stop counting and start estimating. 10% mortality, 20%, 50% in the worst years when grass disappears entirely and supplemental feed costs more than the surviving cattle are worth. And the only choice is to sell at whatever price buyers offer or watch the herd starve and get nothing. Norton operated during one of those cycles. The exact years are unclear, but the court case from 1925 suggests trouble that started earlier, debt that accumulated, expenses that outran revenue, pressure from lenders who could see the numbers deteriorating and wanted their money back before the collateral turned into a herd of dead cows rotting in the desert sun. The investigator has studied enough drought history to know what happens. First, the grass thins. Cattle have to walk farther between water and forage. They burn calories moving instead of gaining weight. Second, the springs slow. Tanks that used to hold water for 6 months now hold it for 3. Ranchers have to move cattle more frequently, disrupting the careful rotation that keeps ranges from getting overgrazed. Third, the markets turn. Everyone facing drought tries to sell at the same time, flooding stockyards with thin cattle that buyers know are distress sales, and prices collapse because supply overwhelms demand, and the packers can wait and watch ranchers undercut each other in a race to liquidate before their herds become worthless. The statewide context makes Norton's story less unique and more representative. Arizona went from 40,000 head of cattle in 1871 to 1.5 million head in the early 1890s, a 37-fold increase in roughly 20 years, growth that could only happen by ignoring carrying capacity, by assuming grass would regenerate faster than cattle could eat it, by treating public range as infinite when it was actually finite and fragile, and already showing signs of stress by the time the boom peaked. When drought hit in the late 1890s, mortality estimates run from 50 to 75%. That is not a recession. That is a die-up. Entire operations vanished. Ranchers who looked wealthy on paper one year were bankrupt the next. The survivors were the ones with cash reserves, with water rights they actually owned, with range that was not already degraded by overgrazing, or with banks willing to extend credit through the crisis on the gamble that wet years would eventually return. The desert collects its debt. The investigator walks the perimeter of the dry tank, looking for infrastructure, pipes, valves, the remnants of systems someone built to make this place more reliable. He finds a length of galvanized pipe, half buried in sand, rusted through, worthless now, but evidence that someone invested in improvements, believed this water source was worth engineering. He spent money they might not have had on materials they had to haul in from town, because surviving in this country requires constant intervention, constant maintenance, constant work, to keep the desert from taking back what you think you control. Norton ran cattle during years when that work got harder, When springs that used to flow year-round started going dry in summer, when tanks that used to fill with monsoon no longer caught enough water to justify the effort of keeping them clean. Climate is the only partner in this business that never negotiates. You cannot convince drought to end early. You cannot bargain with evaporation. You cannot sue the sky for breach of contract when rainfall stays below average for the 5th straight year, and your herd is dying and your debt is compounding, and the bank wants answers you do not have. The cattle business in southern Arizona is fundamentally a BET against climate, a gamble that wet years will outnumber dry years by enough margin to cover costs and leave profit, that you can survive the bad stretches by borrowing against the good ones, that the system will balance out over time, even though the historical record suggests it does not balance. It just swings wildly between extremes and crushes whoever gets caught on the wrong end of the cycle. Norton got caught. The debt numbers prove it. Whether they survived by restructuring or collapsed under the weight is the question the records do not clearly answer, but the pattern suggests collapse. Because most ranches facing that much debt during drought do not reorganize and emerge stronger. They liquidate and disappear, and leave behind place names and stories, and the kind of ruins the investigator keeps finding in canyons where water used to flow and does not flow anymore. Chapter 10. The Foreclosure Map. Now the boundaries move. The investigator sits in his truck with 3 maps spread across the dashboard, a modern topographic sheet, a grazing permit map from the Forest Service, and a hand-drawn property boundary sketch he copied from a 1930s county plat book. The maps do not agree. Springs appear in different locations. Fence lines shift. Property corners that should align by legal description are off by hundreds of yards, sometimes miles, because surveying in mountain country is expensive and imprecise, and most boundaries were established by pacing off distances from landmarks that eroded or burned or got moved by ranchers who needed the line to sit somewhere more convenient than where the original surveyor put it. This is the reality of land ownership in the desert. The legal map and the physical map rarely match, and the difference between them creates space for conflict, for quiet encroachment, for the kind of boundary disputes that do not get resolved by courts because courts require documentation, and documentation requires money, and most people would rather just string wire where it makes sense and dare their neighbor to complain. Norton's empire, if it was an empire, existed in this gap between legal description and physical control. The investigator needs to prove what they actually owned versus what they accessed, what they leased versus what they simply used because nobody stopped them. This means building an evidence ladder. Place names lead to brand book entries lead to deed chains lead to court notices lead to grazing permits lead to water rights, and somewhere in that ladder the shape of the operation becomes visible, not as a single property with clear boundaries, but as a network of strategic parcels and access points that together created control over a territory far larger than what Norton could have afforded to purchase outright. That is how cattle empires worked in the West. You did not buy the whole range. You bought the springs and the crossings and the homestead parcels that blocked your rivals from moving through, and then you ran cattle across public land that belonged to everyone and therefore belonged to whoever grazed it first and defended it hardest. The map overlay expands on his laptop screen. Springs plotted in blue, old fence lines in red, property boundaries in yellow, grazing permit zones in green hatching. The pattern that emerges looks less like a ranch and more like a transportation network, water sources connected by routes, routes controlled by strategic parcels, parcels held through deeds or leases, or simply long-term occupation that became possession in the absence of anyone with better claim. The investigator zooms in on one section, a spring in the Galliuros, a homestead claim at the canyon mouth, a deed transfer in 1923, right in the middle of Norton's documented existence. The buyer's name is unfamiliar, not Norton directly, but the timing suggests a connection, a move to consolidate property or shed assets or restructure ownership in response to financial pressure. History is a paper trail in sand. The documents that survive are random, scattered across archives that were never meant to work together. County records in one building, Forest Service files in another, brand books in a third. Court opinions stored digitally but not indexed in ways that make patterns visible. The investigator has learned to follow threads across systems, to jump from one archive to another based on names or dates or case numbers that appear in footnotes, to treat research like detective work where every small fact might connect to something larger if you have enough patience to keep pulling. He finds another lead in a 1930 court index, Norton versus Steinfeld, a case that went to litigation but whose outcome is not immediately clear because the opinion is not digitized and the paper file is stored in a basement somewhere in Tucson that he will have to visit in person if he wants to read it. The foreclosure map shows something else. As copper prices fell and mining towns shut down, property values collapsed. Land that sold for premium in 1915 was worth a fraction of that by 1925. Ranchers who borrowed against peak valuations suddenly held collateral worth less than their loans. Banks started consolidating, foreclosing on scattered parcels, bundling them, reselling them to larger operations, or holding them as assets on books that showed losses either way. Norton appears on both sides of that equation. They foreclosed on at least one ranch, according to the court case. They also faced foreclosure themselves, or at least fought off a lender trying to seize cattle as collateral. This is not unusual. Cattle companies often operated as creditors and debtors simultaneously, lending to smaller outfits while borrowing from larger banks, creating chains of obligation that could unravel fast when one link broke and defaulted and triggered a cascade of claims and counterclaims that courts had to untangle years later. Real estate and legal mechanisms move together. Deeds transfer, easements get recorded. Inholdings, small private parcels surrounded by public land, become leverage points for controlling access across territories that look open on a map but are effectively locked by whoever owns the one road or the one water source or the one canyon passage that makes the rest of the country usable. The investigator marks these points on his overlay. Copper Creek to the south, the San Pedro crossings to the west, the Galliuro springs to the east. Between them, a lattice of control points that together suggest Norton operated not as a traditional ranch with contiguous pastures, but as a company that understood leverage, that accumulated strategic assets and used them to extract value from a landscape where the real wealth was not in owning land, but in controlling how people and cattle moved through it. That control did not last. The map shows it dissolving, permits expiring, deeds transferring to new owners, boundaries redrawn by agencies that treated the mountains as wilderness instead of range. But for a window of time measured in decades rather than generations, Norton shaped this country, and then disappeared so completely that proving they were ever here requires assembling evidence from fragments scattered across 100 years of archives that nobody bothered to organize because nobody thought the story mattered enough to preserve. Chapter 11. The People Who Did the Work. Someone kept the cattle alive. The investigator searches census pages, scanning columns of names and occupations from Pima County in 1920 and 1930, the decades when Norton was operating, when someone had to actually ride the ranges and check the springs and pull cattle from mud and break ice on water tanks and do the physical work that made the whole system function. The census lists ranchers and ranch owners in neat categories: men whose occupations are recorded as stock raiser or cattle rancher. But the workers are harder to find, scattered through the records as ranch hand or cowboy or laborer, their names often incomplete, their ages approximate, their places of birth reduced to abbreviations: Mex for Mexico, Ariz for Arizona. No detail about which town or which family or which circumstances brought them to this particular piece of desert to work for wages that barely covered survival. Empires always have hands. The investigator knows this. Every cattle operation that claims to have run thousands of head-needed riders, men who could track strays, rope calves for branding, move herds between pastures, stand night watch during calving season, repair fence in country where wire rusts fast and posts rot and rocks shift, and anything man-made requires constant maintenance just to stay functional. The work was hard. The pay was low. Records from similar ranches in the same period suggest cowboys often earned $25 to $35 a month plus food and a place to sleep, which sounds like nothing until you remember that many workers had no other options, that Mexican and Mexican-American vaqueros faced discrimination that locked them out of better jobs, that the cattle industry relied on a labor pool it could exploit, because the alternative to ranch work was often no work at all, or work that was even worse. Norton's workforce is mostly invisible. The investigator finds no payroll ledgers, no employment records, no letters or diaries written by the men who actually rode for the outfit. The silence is not unique. Most ranch archives preserve ownership documents and financial records, but not the names of workers, as if cattle and land and debt matter for history. But the people who did the lifting and riding and dying do not. He finds fragments. A census entry from 1920 lists 3 Mexican nationals living at a Pima County ranch address that might be Norton connected based on the owner's name appearing in a later deed transfer. Their occupations: ranch hand, their ages, 22, 24, 29, no other details, just proof they existed, worked, disappeared from the historical record as thoroughly as if they were never there. The likely backbone of Norton's operation was Mexican and Mexican-American vaqueros. This is educated guessing based on regional patterns. Southern Arizona ranches depended heavily on workers who crossed from Sonora or whose families had lived in the borderlands for generations before the border mattered, who brought horsemanship skills and desert survival knowledge that Anglo cowboys often lacked, and who accepted wages that owners could afford because the system ensured they had few alternatives. The investigator hates this part of the research, the way labor gets erased, the way empires get remembered as the vision of men whose names appear on deeds, while the men who made it possible vanish into abbreviations and blank spaces in census columns. But the erasure is part of the story. It tells you what mattered to the people keeping records. Ownership mattered. Assets mattered. Debts mattered. Workers did not matter enough to name carefully or track after they moved on or acknowledge as anything more than expenses on a balance sheet. The investigator searches for cemetery records, hoping to find grave markers that might list occupation or employer. He finds nothing conclusive. Most ranch workers who died on the job were buried in family plots or small cemeteries that kept minimal records or no records, their deaths noted only if they caused legal trouble or financial loss, forgotten otherwise. The court cases mention workers only in passing. Testimony about who was present when a fence dispute happened, who witnessed a cattle sale, who can verify which brand appeared on which animals. The workers are scenery in someone else's drama, present but not important, needed but not valued, essential to the operation but expendable in the accounting of who built what and who deserves to be remembered. Labor economics explain part of this. If you pay a cowboy $30 a month and run an operation with debt measured in tens of thousands, the wage bill is a rounding error compared to interest payments and land costs and the capital required to acquire breeding stock. The math only works if someone else does the work cheaply enough that you can capture the difference between their labor value and what the market pays for beef. This is not moralizing. This is just how the system functioned. Ranchers squeezed between buyers who set low prices and banks that demanded repayment, and workers squeezed beneath ranchers who could only survive by keeping wages low and conditions hard and turnover high, because a worker who stayed long enough to demand better treatment was a worker who threatened the thin margins that kept the whole operation solvent. Norton participated in this system. They had to. There was no other way to run cattle at scale in the desert. The workers who made it possible left almost nothing behind except the faint traces the investigator keeps finding, a census line, a deed witness signature, a place name that might commemorate someone or might just describe terrain. The empire ended. The workers dispersed. The land kept better records than the people, and the people who survived to tell stories remembered owners and brands and debts, but rarely remembered the names of the men who actually did the writing. Chapter 12. The company disappears, then the name goes quiet. The investigator searches through brand books from the 1930s and 40s looking for Norton Land and Cattle Company, flipping pages of cattle marks and ownership claims, and the name that appeared multiple times in 1921 is simply gone by 1935, replaced by other companies, other brands, other operations that either bought the assets or filled the vacuum Norton left behind. The disappearance is not dramatic. There is no final court case declaring bankruptcy, no newspaper obituary announcing the end of an empire, no auction notice listing cattle and equipment for sale. The company just stops appearing in records, present one year, absent the next, erased with the bureaucratic finality of a name that no longer needs to be registered because the entity behind it no longer exists or no longer operates in a way that requires official documentation. Disappearing is a strategy. The investigator has seen this pattern before. When cattle companies face insurmountable debt, they often dissolve quietly rather than go through formal bankruptcy, which creates public records and attracts creditors and turns private failure into documented humiliation. Owners walk away. Assets get sold piecemeal. Permits lapse. Water rights revert to whoever files next. The landscape absorbs the infrastructure. Springs go back to natural seeps. Stock tanks fill with sediment. Fence wire rusts through and falls. And within a generation, the physical evidence becomes hard to distinguish from random debris scattered across country that has seen 100 failed operations come and go. Norton left place names: Norton Spring, Norton Canyon. But place names persist long after people forget who Norton was, or whether Norton was a person or a company, or just a convenient label someone attached to a landmark decades ago. The ranch history narrative that survives in family stories says the bank took over. The operation supposedly moved to Phoenix in 1938 after foreclosure or forced sale or some financial reckoning that the storytellers describe vaguely because the details were either never known or too painful to preserve. The investigator treats this claim carefully. It fits the timeline. 1938 is late enough that drought and depression would have crushed most over-leveraged operations, early enough that some physical infrastructure might have still existed, close enough to living memory that someone's grandfather might have actually witnessed the transition. But moved to Phoenix is suspect. Cattle operations do not move, they liquidate. What might have moved to Phoenix was ownership, a bank taking possession of deeds and leases, an investor buying distressed assets, a family relocating after losing everything. The cattle stayed in the desert or got sold. The springs stayed where they were. The Galuros did not relocate to Phoenix. Only the paperwork moved. The investigator finds another lead buried in a court index, Norton versus Steinfeld, filed in 1930, 5 years after the Tucson cattle loan case. This is the kind of breadcrumb that makes investigation possible, a case that suggests Norton was still operational, or at least still litigating disputes well into the Depression, still fighting over money or property or contracts with other parties who had their own financial troubles. The case file is not digitized. To read it, he will need to drive to Tucson, find the county clerk's office, request the physical document from whatever basement or warehouse stores records from that era, hope the file still exists and is legible and contains something more substantial than routine procedural motions. Most legal fights from this period are dead ends. Two parties arguing over assets that turned out to be worthless, settlements reached because both sides were broke, cases dismissed when the plaintiff or defendant dissolved before judgment could be entered. But sometimes the files contain witness testimony, financial disclosures, maps, details that did not make it into the published opinion but survived in the case jacket because clerks filed everything and storage was cheaper than sorting. Most ranch empires do not end in gunfights. They end in paperwork. Deeds stamped foreclosed, permits marked expired, brand registrations that simply stop being renewed, court judgments that establish debt but collect nothing because the debtor has already disappeared, already reformed under a new name, or moved to a different country, or died, leaving heirs who want no part of inherited liability. The investigator thinks about the men who ran Norton, whoever they were, whatever their names, whether they were locals or investors from back east or Phoenix speculators who saw opportunity in southern Arizona range and borrowed too much to exploit it. They probably believed they could win. Most people who build empires believe that. They see the good years and project them forward. They calculate returns based on peak prices. They assume drought will break and grass will recover, and markets will rebound, and all the variables will align in their favor if they can just hold on long enough. And then the variables do not align. The rain does not come. The prices stay low. The debt comes due. And the empire that felt permanent reveals itself as temporary, built on borrowed money and borrowed time and environmental conditions that stopped cooperating the moment someone tried to control them. The land kept better records than people did. Springs still seep, canyons still drain, fence posts still rot in place where someone pounded them into rock a century ago. The investigator hikes to another ruin, this one deeper in the Galuros, harder to reach, less certain in its connection to Norton, but possible, plausible, worth checking. Stone walls 4 feet high, no roof, no door, just a rectangle that once enclosed space where someone cooked or slept or stored equipment. He photographs it, measures it, marks the GPS coordinates. He cannot prove this was Norton. But he also cannot prove it was not. And that ambiguity is the point. The empire vanished so thoroughly that even the ruins refused to be labeled with certainty, refused to confirm or deny the stories, Just stand there silent in the desert, waiting for someone to care enough to assemble the fragments and admit that some questions do not have clean answers, only the messy, inconclusive evidence of things that used to matter and do not matter anymore, except to the few stubborn people who think history is worth pursuing, even when history does not want to be found. Chapter 13. The Land Outlives the Name. The map changes again. The investigator stands where cattle once grazed and hikers now pass, where the infrastructure of ranching has been slowly dismantled or left to decay, where the Galiuro Wilderness designation in 1984 redrew the boundaries of what is allowed and what is forbidden in these mountains. The wilderness law ended commercial grazing on 76,000 acres of range that had supported cattle for a century, turned working landscape into protected landscape, transformed springs from ranch assets into public resources managed for wildlife and recreation instead of livestock production. The change was not sudden. Permits expired gradually. Fences came down section by section. Cattle were moved to other ranges or sold off. By the late 1980s, the mountains were empty of domestic stock for the first time since the 1870s, returned to a version of wildness that is not quite natural. Too many roads still scar the hillsides. Too many exotic grasses grow where native plants used to dominate. Too much infrastructure remains scattered across canyons, but wild enough that most visitors experience it as untouched, as a place where human impact is minimal and nature runs its own course. The land survives. Ownership does not. The investigator drives down from the mountains toward the San Pedro River, following pavement that did not exist when Norton ran cattle, passing through country that looks empty but is actually contested in new ways, fought over by different interests with different goals. The river corridor is protected now, designated as the San Pedro Riparian National Conservation Area on November 18, 1988. Roughly 40 miles of waterway and floodplain managed by the Bureau of Land Management for conservation values instead of commodity extraction. The designation came after decades of argument between ranchers who wanted continued grazing access, environmentalists who wanted protection for migratory birds and endangered species, developers who saw the valley as potential suburbs, and agencies trying to balance competing demands on land that cannot satisfy everyone simultaneously. The protection is real but fragile. The investigator parks at a trailhead where interpretive signs explain the area's ecological significance: over 400 species of birds, threatened fish, rare plants that depend on perennial water in a region where water is increasingly scarce. He walks along the river, watching cottonwoods sway in afternoon wind, listening to the sound of water moving over stones, thinking about how different this place would look if Norton's vision had prevailed, if the cattle empire had survived and consolidated and turned this corridor into private ranch land, inaccessible to the public, fenced and controlled and managed for profit instead of preservation. The empire failed. The land became public. Whether that counts as victory depends on who you ask and what you value: biodiversity versus beef production, recreation versus ranching, the commons versus private property. The modern stakes are different but no less real. Water remains the central issue. The San Pedro flows north from Mexico through one of the fastest-growing regions in Arizona, through communities that need groundwater for homes and businesses and lawns, through agricultural operations that still depend on irrigation, through a desert that cannot support the human population already living here and definitely cannot support the population projected for the next 50 years. The river is over-appropriated, more water claimed through rights and permits than actually flows in most years. a paper abundance built on wet year assumptions that ignore the dry year reality. Some years the river stops flowing entirely in certain stretches, dries to isolated pools, fails to connect the ecosystem it is supposed to sustain. The investigator has read the studies. The aquifer is dropping. The cottonwoods are dying. The birds are declining. The protection designation saved the land from one threat, but cannot save it from the larger crisis of too many people demanding too much water from a system that has no surplus to give. Norton is gone, but the pattern continues. Different players, different language. Same fundamental conflict over who controls access to limited resources in a landscape that cannot support unlimited growth. The investigator thinks about the court cases from the 1920s, the debt and foreclosure and legal fights over cattle and water and land, and realizes those conflicts never really ended. They just evolved, shifted form, became arguments about conservation easements and groundwater pumping and endangered species instead of arguments about grazing permits and brand ownership and fence lines. The questions persist. Who decides how land gets used? Who profits from the decision? Who pays the cost? The empire was built on controlling answers to those questions. The empire fell when the answers changed. And now new empires are forming, not ranches but subdivisions, not cattle barons but real estate developers, not cowboys but commuters. And the land keeps absorbing the pressure, keeps bending under the weight of human demands, keeps trying to support systems that extract more than it can regenerate. The sun drops toward the horizon. The investigator walks back to his truck. Around him, the river valley stretches green and alive, temporarily protected, temporarily safe, held in trust by agencies that have budgets and mandates, but not guarantees, not permanence, not immunity from political pressure or economic crisis, or the slow grinding logic that says protected land is wasted land if it could be generating revenue instead of habitat. Norton lasted maybe 2 decades before collapsing under debt and drought. The wilderness designation is 40 years old and already under stress. The conservation area is 36 years old and already contested. The land outlives every claim made upon it. The land survives. But survival is not victory. It is just the condition of still being here when the next fight starts, when the next empire rises, when the next generation decides the rules no longer serve their interests and begins the work of rewriting boundaries that the previous generation believed were settled forever. Chapter 14. Who owns the water now? Nothing stays empty forever. The investigator stands at the spring one last time, the same concrete box and rusted pipe he found on his first hike into these mountains, the same green pocket in the brown desert, the same evidence of human intervention in a landscape that pretends to be wild. He pulls out his phone and opens the map overlay, all the layers at once, springs and routes and property lines and permits, and the faint outline of an empire that existed for maybe 20 years before dissolving into the gaps between documents. The pattern is clear now. Norton was never about owning land. It was about controlling water, about holding the strategic points that made everything else functional or useless, depending on whether you had access or got locked out. The disappearance is the message. The investigator has spent months chasing fragments, brand book entries, court cases, census records, family stories that might be true or might be exaggerated or might be complete fabrications built on kernels of fact too small to verify. He has found proof that Norton existed, operated at scale, borrowed heavily, fought legal battles, and then vanished from the record with the quiet finality of a name that stops appearing in registrations and deed transfers and the administrative paperwork that keeps businesses visible to bureaucracies. The exact parcels Norton owned remain unclear. The exact people who ran the company remain mostly anonymous. The exact spring control they exercised can be inferred but not documented with the precision that would satisfy a court or a historian demanding footnotes for every claim. Control can be invisible. That is the lesson the desert teaches. You do not need to announce your power if geography does the announcing for you. You do not need a monument if the land itself becomes the monument, springs that bear your name, canyons that carry your mark, roots that exist because you cleared them, or fenced them, or simply used them so consistently that they became the path everyone else follows without questioning why this trail and not another, why this crossing and not the one a mile downstream. Norton shaped this country. Then Norton disappeared, and the shaping remains, even though the name has faded, even though most people hiking these mountains have never heard of the company and would not care if they had, because the history they came for is geological, not human, is measured in millions of years, not decades, is written in stone, not in the fragile paper records that survive only when someone bothers to preserve them. History forgets what leaves no headlines. Norton never made headlines. No range wars, no dramatic shootouts, no telegenic disasters that newspapers could sensationalize. Just the quiet accumulation of strategic assets, the boring mechanics of credit and debt and foreclosure, the slow collapse under pressures that felt external, drought, markets, banks, but were actually built into the system from the beginning, were guaranteed the moment someone borrowed against future profits in a business where nature controls the variables, and humans just pretend they are in charge until conditions shift and the pretense becomes impossible to maintain. The investigator closes the map, pockets his phone, drinks the last of his water. Around him, the Galuros rise silent and indifferent, mountains that have absorbed 100 empires and will absorb 100 more, that outlast ownership and claims and the very concept of property by simply continuing to exist when everything human eventually fails. One grounded answer: water control plus isolation. That combination built Norton. Springs gave them leverage, debt gave them scale, geography gave them protection from competition. For a window of time, the variables aligned and the system worked well enough to register in official records, to make people remember the name, to create the infrastructure that still dots these canyons a century later. Then the variables stopped aligning. Drought dried the grass. Markets dropped the prices. Banks called the loans, and the empire collapsed, not because anyone defeated it, but because the conditions that made it possible simply evaporated, and without those conditions the whole structure had no foundation, nothing to stand on, nothing to justify the debt or the effort or the belief that cattle ranching in the Arizona desert could ever be permanent. One lingering mystery: the exact people, the exact parcels, the exact moment when Norton stopped being an operating company and became a ghost story, a place name, a footnote in archives that most people will never search. The investigator knows he will never find complete answers. The records are too scattered, too incomplete, too damaged by time and indifference, and the basic fact that nobody thought this story mattered enough to preserve carefully. But incomplete answers are still answers. They prove Norton was real. They prove the empire existed. They prove the pattern, water control, strategic leverage, quiet power, quiet collapse that repeats across every western range where someone tried to build permanence from grass and debt and environmental conditions that refused to cooperate long enough for dynasties to take root. One final image. The spring keeps flowing. Water seeps from fractured limestone, pools in the concrete box someone poured decades ago, trickles down the rusted pipe, disappears into gravel 20 feet downstream. Around the seep, a pocket of green persists, grass that stays alive when everything else burns brown, shrubs that hold moisture, birds that stop here during migration because this is the only water for 10 miles in any direction. The investigator photographs it one last time. The infrastructure is failing. The pipe will rust through completely within a few years. The concrete will crack and crumble. Eventually, the spring will return to its natural state, just a wet spot on a hillside, unmarked and uncontrolled. But for now, it stands as evidence. Someone was here. Someone cared enough to build. Someone believed this water was worth engineering, worth claiming, worth defending. The empire is gone. The water remains. And the question lingers in the desert air like heat shimmer over stone. Was Norton a ranch or just a water company with a brand?